So hello everyone and welcome to the HRD podcast. I'm thrilled to say that we're joined by Matthew Taylor, the CEO of the Royal Society of Arts. Hi Matthew.
Hi.
Today we're going to be discussing predominantly the future of work and what that will look like. Matthew, firstly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
So I'm the Chief Executive of the RSA. Its full name is the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce, but we don't use that very often. I've been doing that for 12 years. I never thought I'd kind of do any job for more than 4 or 5 years, but it's a fantastic organisation and it continues to evolve and develop and change. And anyway, I've kind of reached the age where nobody else wants me.
It's not true.
I recently did a piece of work for the Prime Minister. Obviously, I don't know when this is being broadcast, so I'd also say the Prime Minister as we speak, Theresa May, because we live in a fast-changing world and she's currently fighting to save her Brexit deal. So I did a piece of work for the Prime Minister on the future of work called Good Work. What else? I'm on the Government's Industrial Strategy Council, partly to emphasise this element of work as part of our industrial strategy. So that's kind of me as a working person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I suppose bringing forward to the future of work and talking about it, I just wanted to track back a bit and think, from your perspective, what's been the most dramatic change over the last 10 to 15 years in the working environment?
Well, actually, I don't think that change has been as dramatic as people like to say. One of the characteristics of every society, particularly since industrialisation, since the Enlightenment, is every society always believes that it is in a unique moment of change, that change is more dramatic than it's ever been before. So, we, like all our previous generations, have this feeling about where we are. And I think it's important to kind of temper that by actually looking at what the statistics say. So, some things have changed. There's been a growth in self-employment, and interestingly, that growth in self-employment has not died back significantly when the labour markets got tighter. So in previous times, we've seen growth of self-employment at times of high unemployment as people try to find other ways of making ends meet. But this growth in self-employment, up to I think around 11% of the workforce, doesn't seem to be dying back, even though in most places there's plentiful work available. Obviously, we've seen a lot of attention to the growth of gig work, and in one sense that is new. So people working through platforms that intermediate between the client and themselves, on-demand work, so being able to work whenever you want to, that kind of flexibility, that is new. But actually, the employment form that involves isn't particularly new. So particularly if you look at Uber has largely displaced minicab firms that had a very similar way of operating, just much less high-tech and on a much smaller, more local scale. The other thing I think it's important to emphasise is that one of the cliches that you hear about work is that that people are turning over their jobs, that people are much more footloose, there's much more change. Actually, people are staying longer in their jobs now than they were a few years ago. Not by much, but a little bit longer. So I think economists would say that actually one of the problems with our economy, one of our productivity challenges, is that people probably stay too long in the same job, because the best way to boost your earnings and to become more productive is to change your job. And so if people stay in the same job too long, they don't do that. And I ought to take my own advice, I guess, but I love the RSA too much.
So where do you think this idea that millennials are jumping around, job hopping, we can't stay in a role for longer than about 2 or 3 years. Where's that coming from if actually, as a whole, we're all staying in jobs for longer?
So I think people often confuse a cohort effect, the fact that young people may have a different approach to work. They may move around more quickly with a more deep shift. And it may be that today's millennials, in as much as they do move around jobs more often, once they become middle-aged or a bit older, once they get married or they have a mortgage or they just find the thing they want to do, then they will stick. So I think we don't know really whether or not there is if the millennials are any different at all, apart from the fact that they're reasonably young at the moment. The other thing I'd say that I think is important is that in all of these conversations about work, we need to make a distinction between the people with good educational qualifications, good prospects, money behind them, and people at the bottom end of the labour market. And so the conversation I might have, and I have these conversations from time to time with, I don't know, a city law firm, where the big issue is how do they recruit and retain talent, and they're really thinking very hard about that challenge, is completely different to the experience of young people in an economy where there aren't enough jobs, there aren't enough good jobs, who don't have a great deal of choice about what they do. So it's very difficult to make generalisations about work when you don't recognise the fundamental difference between what the Resolution Foundation once called the privileged and the precariat.
And as a people leader yourself, do you think there's something that can be done to really differentiate between companies and, I guess, help retain their talent, and something that they can do differently to attract the talent of tomorrow, next year?
Yeah, so I think there are things you can do about recruiting and retaining talent. I think, though, I would tend to say the important question is your organisation an effective organisation? And if it is, then the recruitment and retention issue will solve itself. I think if you've got an organisation that's dysfunctional, and then you say, well, even though the organisation doesn't really work and people aren't very happy here, let's pay people more to start here, or let's try and find ways of forcing people to stay here. That's not the best approach. So I would say focus on your organisation being a great organisation. And I think we know quite a lot now about what are the kinds of organisations that people want to work for. They want to work for organisations that are well managed, have a strong sense of purpose, that provide something that people value. And when I say that, I don't just mean something kind of ethically highfalutin like the RSA. I mean, I was talking to the chief executive of McDonald's the other day. I think McDonald's is a pretty good employer, a very effective company, and I think the people who work at McDonald's in a good, well-run McDonald's store feel a sense of value because they're providing food that people want in an environment that people enjoy. So there's that, I think. So mission, purpose, leadership, but also autonomy and trust. You want to feel within an organisation that you have got the scope, you're encouraged to make your own judgments, to be heard, to have voice, that you're respected as a human being, not just seen as a cog in the machine. And now these things are on top of the basics, which is, pay and conditions and health and safety. So all that's got to be in place. But as long as that's in place, then it's these issues like the quality of management, the degree of autonomy, whether or not you've got scope to develop and grow. So that's another thing about McDonald's, for example. They've got a great story about the social mobility of people who started as, flipping burgers or making burgers and have ended up running, multi-million-pound franchises. It's a very good story. And then another factor, of course, is work-life balance. And people do want to have a workplace where it's possible for them to balance their work and caring responsibilities and just having a kind of well-balanced life.
And do you think all of those factors you've just covered, do you think technology is a big enabler of this when you talk about work-life balance, when you talk about autonomy? Where do you think that factors into it all?
Yeah, so in my report, Good Work for the Prime Minister, I talked about the difference between one-way flexibility and two-way flexibility. And I think that technology, that's a good way of thinking about technology. So technology, when badly applied, provides flexibility or control to employers and not a great deal to the employee. So when you hear about people having devices fitted to them as they work in warehouses in order to kind of measure the number of minutes they spend going to the toilet or to, speed up the intensity with which they do their work, that's a technological shift that doesn't really have much of an upside for the worker. On the other hand, Tesco, I think Tesco have an app which enables you, if you want to work in any Tesco, if you've got the right skills. You're in a different part of the country, you can work in any Tesco store. Again, I was talking to McDonald's about this and about the scope that might exist because they're a global company, to say to people, actually, if you've got the basic training at McDonald's, you can go around the world and you can work for a few days in McDonald's stores all over the place. And some of the good labour platforms also provide that flexibility. And whilst I believe that Uber and Deliveroo should recognise the people who work for them as workers and give them worker rights, and they ought to pay worker taxes on those people, and I've been very clear about that. It is important to recognise that providing people with the option of working whenever they want to work is a significant piece of flexibility that, generally speaking, workers have never had in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people underestimate this. They underestimate how different that kind of notion of on-demand work is. So, complicated answer, but I think in the end, we mustn't be technological determinists. The question about technology is, does it help us to have great working lives and great lives in general? And if technology is implemented in an exploitative and insensitive and one-sided way, it's going to make people angry and it's going to make them ultimately not very effective workers. But if it's implemented in a creative and fair two-way kind of way, it can really improve people's working lives and also improve the productivity of organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, among different demographics, there might be different attitudes towards technology. Have you got an opinion around the way we should be educating our workers around new technology, devices, maybe more efficient ways of communicating?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of organisations would say that the challenge they've got is that younger people come into the workforce with a set of skills in relation to the use of social media. And then the problem is that it's hard for the organisation, the work organisation, to take advantage of those kinds of skills because of the kind of way bureaucracies work and risk aversion and that kind of thing. So I think, the challenge for a lot of organisations is actually we've got a workforce that just knows how to use this stuff and uses it day in, day out. How do we make sure that our systems enable them to apply those skills? I think more generally, the challenge we've got about technology is that we are very pessimistic about it at the moment. And that's something to worry about. And that's something that's connected to some of the other broader issues we see in society, polarisation, populism. So I sometimes talk about my grandfather. And I remember when I was a kid and the first colour televisions came around. And my grandfather was an engineer. He thought colour televisions were so exciting. And he thought that the colour television was kind of like one step on an unbroken path that would lead to colonies on Mars, And I contrast his enthusiasm about that relatively modest bit of technology to the fact that we are now overwhelmed with scientific and technological innovation. But actually, if you say to the public, will the future be better than the past? I'm afraid most people say no, it won't. They think their children will have a worse future than them. So we've really got to get away from this notion that the robots are coming, that AI is going to take over the world. We've got to say, ultimately, the human beings are in charge. And the measure of a technology has got to be, does it make people's lives better?